Thank you so much, Carolyn. Thank all the people who made visit possible. It's like to spend at least a few days a year in a country that offers health care. It makes me very nervous, but it's probably doesn't endanger me too much. In the United States, we don't acknowledge that we stole our country from the Indians. We don't, because we know that it was God's will that we do so. So we don't need to speak about it as a result of that. I'm going to be giving you a glimpse of the future of higher education if you turn your gaze toward the evil empire to the south, which, alas, is helping to shape the future of higher education, not just in the United States, but around the world. But resistance is not futile, and by that I largely mean that solidarity on a given campus, solidarity not just amongst the faculty, where sometimes it is a faint hope to find it, but also, especially if one reaches out to students, undergraduates, graduate students, sometimes staff members, one can kind of build solidarity from the ground up, in part because solidarity in higher education requires a certain amount of idealism, and you find it in the young more easily than you do in much of the rest of the world. Those of you who are younger, this is your chance, I think, to take control of the institution where you live and make certain that you can resist very powerful forces that I think, at least, don't augur well for the future of higher education. In one of my books, No University is an Island, I began by describing academic freedom, tenure, and shared governance as three legs of a stool, thus suggesting that these three principles are interdependent, that the stool would tip over if any one of the three principles failed. You can't put one of the three in practice without the other two. If one of the three is severely weakened, the other two will be weakened as well. Most academics, I think, by now understand that one or more of these three principles is threatened, but not all see their relationship to one another. Some have no investment in one or the other. Some feel anger or contempt for one or more of those legs. They may feel contempt for shared governance, not worth their time, beneath their effort. They may feel contempt for tenure if they can't get it, and they resent those who have it. Many have no personal experience of one, two, or even three of those legs, or the practices that enact and sustain them. In the US, over 2/3 of college and university faculty nationwide, if you look aggregate at the whole series of 3,500 colleges and universities in the United States, I've visited most of them, I'm afraid to say, over 2/3 of the people standing in front of a classroom in the college or university classroom in the United States are contingent. And the most powerful statistic that you can offer about American higher education is that in 1975, 2/3 of the faculty either had tenure or were eligible for tenure. 30 years later, 2005, 1/3 had tenure or were eligible for tenure. So in those 30 years, the statistics actually flipped. And of course, I actually ran into people at that point who said, well, it's peaked. It's not going to get any worse. And I'd say, what is it about a trend that you think means it stops when it's been going on for 30 years? I mean, what is it? Well, I just think, it's not going to get any worse, right? By contingent faculty, I mean mostly what in Canada you call sessional faculty, or the Mexicans actually get it better. They call them precarious faculty, which I think hits it on the nose, as it were. Many of them have little experience of academic freedom, no experience of job security, let alone what seems the elite privilege of tenure, and indeed no experience of participating in shared governance, and in large part because in the United States, the overwhelming majority of what you would call sessional faculty are not represented by a union. They have no organized representation, no organized voice. And when I say they don't participate in shared governance, I think there's no more striking example of what that means other than that in many many American campuses, you'll find a particular course, say introductory writing, introductory math, introductory history. All of the sections of that course are taught by what you would call sessional faculty. Every now and again, the tenured faculty get together and decide what should be taught in the course, and usually there's not a single person in the room who teaches the course in that meeting. That's the kind of really kind of grotesque perversion of shared governance that prevails at so many American campuses. And then, of course, the tenured faculty who meet in that room often have little sympathy for their untenured colleagues and little inclination even to invite their participation in shared governance, let alone advocate for some tenure-like form of job security. So why should, in the United States, the most vulnerable teachers amongst us defend rights that they do not have? Some remarkably do. But many, after a decade or 2 decades of living with insecurity, don't have any respect for the tenure system whatsoever. And in the US, many sessional faculty are on 1-year or 1-semester contracts. They only learn just before, in August, typically, they learn whether they're going to be employed the following year. I've known many, many such people who have to sign a lease before they know whether they're, or an apartment before they know whether they're going to have a job for the next year. And I know people who routinely give up their apartment because they don't know whether they're going to be able to pay the rent. And then, if they do get a job, they scramble to find a new place in the same city where they're living. So they, from year to year to year, they segue from one place to the next to live because they just can't sign a lease committing themselves to a payment when they don't know if they're going to be getting a salary check. It's really quite grotesque. Even if you recognize on your own campus how this interlocking system betrays any sense of collegiality, relatively few people in most, either in Canada, I think, or in the United States, understand that the 3 principles of the stool that I talked about are all nationally interdependent in some way. That when one campus abandons those principles, it puts in danger every other campus that is trying to sustain them. These patterns influence campuses nationally, and once you pass a certain tipping point, then everyone is weakened. And my conviction is that only strong national organizations, the AAUP in the United States, CAUT in Canada, can articulate and defend the principles that are realized on individual campuses. It's hard to convince people in the United States on our most elite campuses that no matter how good they think their faculty are not going to define the fundamental principles that higher education needs to shape it. You have to have a national organization that brings together people from all across the country, from all sorts of different campuses, to work together to articulate the principles which, even if you sustain them, need to be rewritten. New principles arise, new conditions arise. You know, the AUP, my organization, began articulating those principles in 1915, and you'll be surprised to know we didn't say one word about MOOCs at that point. We just didn't, we didn't have our finger on the pulse. I think that faculty, all faculty, need to negotiate legally binding contracts that secure their academic freedom, maintain shared governance rights, and maximize the applicability of tenure. Even good administrators, and there are some, rarer than hen's teeth, in today's corporatized environment, need a strong unionized faculty behind them. I often locate good administrators who need a faculty voice to articulate a position because they can't step forward and do it or they'll lose their jobs. So in an ideal world, that faculty strength, the strength of a graduate student union that can secure graduate teaching rights, that actually helps administrators who have good impulses resist some of their colleagues and resist national trends. There's no question that we've reached a tipping point in the United States. Runaway contingency has left everyone vulnerable, emboldening conservative legislators and unsympathetic administrators alike to try to replace that 3-legged stool entirely with something else, to give up the whole thing, not just weaken part of it, but eliminate everything. what amounts to a kind of inflationary contingency in the United States has made all of us in higher education a target of opportunity. Most faculty members now know that some powerful force, maybe one they recognize, is putting this whole system of balances at risk. But there's a lot more that people need to learn. All of these forces intersect with one another. So over-reliance on contingent faculty intersects with the impulse to defund public higher education, which intersects with an instrumental job training model of higher education, which intersects with a conservative agenda of eviscerating political critique within the academy. All of those things are now interlocking in the United States, which is why I think we've reached that sort of tipping point. Obviously, if you want to prevent faculty members from being politically frank and honest in the classroom, if the faculty members you're trying to restrain have no job security, you have an easier time getting away with repressing their freedom of speech. Now, here at Simon Fraser, you recently defeated one of the major emerging threats to higher education. In the United States, at least, and in Europe, and in England, I think that is the major threat to higher education. If one has to isolate one force and say that's going to do the most damage, it's the assessment and accountability movement. And you fought it back at Simon Fraser, and it's a great victory. But you didn't kill it. You needed the stake in the heart, and you didn't quite drive that home. I think it's quite a challenge. What does the assessment and accountability movement portend for higher education? Well, let's just make a list of 10 things. 1, to make course syllabi more uniform. 2, to force compliance with common pedagogical goals. 3, to give absolute priority to measuring pedagogical success by quantifiable means. 4, to decrease the diversity of educational experiences to which students are exposed. 5, to erode faculty academic freedom to design courses that as they believe best and to honor their individual pedagogical philosophies. 6, to sidestep the shared governance processes that should lead to faculty consensus about common elements of multi-section courses. 7, to cede definitions of institutional mission to external political and economic forces. 8, to replace the liberal arts with job training. 9, to eliminate tenure. 10, to maximize corporate influence over higher education and ultimately turn it into a service industry. Now, there aren't any good things about that list. I hope that was clear. And it's also, to a significant degree, a multinational trend. The assessment and accountability movement is holding sway over most European countries and certainly over Great Britain. There's been a little bit of resistance to it in Australia. We'll see if it holds. The strength and solidarity that you mustered in the last year need to be sustained and reinforced, and that requires continuing collective action. Not just what usually happens in universities is faculty and students coalesce in a crisis and then the solidarity fades away. I don't think we're in a scene now where you can rise to every occasion if there's no ongoing collective work. I just don't think you're going to be able to pull that off any more than we are going to. But I don't know if any of you actually have an idea of what an altogether assessment and accountability-oriented curriculum looks like, or what an institution looks like if it gives way to those values completely. I think the beast that you were fighting was worse than you realized. So that's what I want to do now, is to give you a picture of what it means, because such institutions already exist, at least down there. Is that the right direction? I have no idea. No, okay. Well, it's a symbolic gesture then. So I'll cite 2 really, and one is called Western Governors University. I don't know how many of you have heard of it. And the other is Southern University of New Hampshire. That's a state in the United States. At Western Governors University, the entire curriculum is online, and every course has a list of learning outcomes, every course, that are enumerated and tested. The same principles apply to the online division at Southern New Hampshire University, which is the largest part of their institution. You don't accumulate credits for courses in the conventional way. You accumulate the particular number of tested competencies built into a given course. The course may have one tested competency, it may have 3, it may have 4, it varies. That's what goes on your transcript, the competencies that you have tested in and that then are demonstrable to a potential employer. At both of those institutions, the traditional 3-credit course is gone. Paul LeBlanc, who is the president of Southern New Hampshire University, quips that the 3-credit course is good at telling you how long someone has sat at a desk, but it's not any good at telling you what they've learned. To Western Governors University's credit, there is weekly phone contact with a mentor assigned to each student. You don't meet other students face to face, but someone calls you up once a week to ask you how you're doing. And those mentors have about 85 students that they call up once a week, obviously for a conversation lasting many hours. The system becomes profitable, the faculty compliant, not only because of the literally hundreds of part-time teachers employed, but also, and even more fundamentally, because of the unbundling of faculty responsibilities. 2 weeks ago, I was in a meeting with 30 business leaders who were being sold this model of education, and I was there as the humanities person to offer a counter perspective, but it was completely obvious to me that they just loved this prospect. Rather than call it unbundling, the president of New Hampshire describes it as disaggregation. And he applies it to faculty responsibilities and identity. And he says, quote, "At Southern New Hampshire University, we have blown apart the traditional faculty role." Blown apart the traditional faculty role. That's his words, offered cheerfully, I must say, not mine. So, the person who delivers course content at WGU or SNH is not the person who grades student performance. The person who does the phone mentoring at WGU, assigned by student, not by course, is yet a third employee. It's not the person who delivers course content or evaluates performance. All student advising is not done by faculty members who teach courses. It's done by yet other employees. At WGU, they farm out student advising to a corporation that markets student advising. So the advising is done by corporate employees who aren't on campus. Of course, there is no campus. There's a building, an administrative building at WGU. So the whole set of teaching responsibilities that we ordinarily associate with a faculty member have been unbundled, disaggregated, and if it wasn't obvious without my saying so, research is eliminated. I mean, who needs to pay for anyone doing any research under that system? It's gone, so that's gone as well. The person who creates an online lecture never meets his or her students. You create the lecture for a course, but you then don't deliver it, and you don't meet anybody who's listening to it. A course can then be divided into segments, and those segments designed by individual faculty who also don't meet each other. WGU shops the country to find people to design content for courses. They like to say, we don't create courses, we buy them. Their competencies are designed by groups of people who get together beforehand, mostly businessmen and women, and identify competencies that they want courses to produce in people. And then they go out to find people to generate lectures that will help create those competencies. The administrators who run the programs don't design courses or assess student performance. So if you think about that now, and I really think, I may be wrong, but I'm not sure that any of you would have realized that there are institutions that have completely disaggregated the faculty identity. I mean, faculty as we know them are simply gone. I mean, even to refer to any of these, WGU will say, well, there's the faculty that do advising, there's the faculty that design course content, there's the faculty that grade the student performances, but that word faculty is just there because they think it sounds good, but I don't think it means anything any longer in that kind of context. You might ask, why would the people paid to perform tasks like these give a damn about academic freedom, tenure, or shared governance? That's the stool, the three legs of the stool. They're paid to complete narrowly defined tasks. As I said, in my view, they actually aren't faculty anymore at all. They're service workers in the higher education industry. Obviously, WGU and UNH have achieved the complete Taylorization of the academy. It's the fully realized assembly line version of higher education. Everyone is accountable for measurable performance, everything is assessed, and it works. Though WGU specializes in older students who are working at jobs and clearly motivated to acquire new skills. And just in case you were wondering, WGU does not offer a philosophy major, a history major, or anything else in the humanities. WGU is divided into 4 colleges: business, teaching, information technology, and health professions. You can earn a bachelor's degree in nursing, business management, accounting, and other fields. You can earn a master's in science education, instructional design, English as a second language. Everything about the institution is altogether functional, goal-oriented. It's worth noting that Barack Obama's Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, says he wants WGU to be the norm for higher education. So I'm not making this shit up, right? Not the exception. Obama himself has praised Southern New Hampshire University as a model. So the 2 schools that I've cited are much admired by America's liberal democratic institution. Wait till the Republicans get back in power. They're, of course, going to be strong defenders of academic freedom, shared governance, and faculty rights. The pendulum will swing back toward the three-legged stool as soon as the Republicans are in. Look, I don't have a problem with WGU being whatever it is, or with Southern New Hampshire University. They're providing a service that some people want. But that's capitalism, it's going to happen. At WGU, it's clearly equivalent to technical training. They make no pretense of offering a full liberal arts education. They teach business, they don't teach business ethics. I mean, it's not the liberal arts version of what these disciplines would be. Southern New Hampshire, however, is actually more ambitious, and they offer a wider range of degrees. But my problem, nonetheless, remains with using institutions like that as suitable models for replacing a large swath of higher education, and our supposedly pro-education democratic leadership in the United States seems eager to climb on board. There isn't actually any difference between the Democrats and the Republicans on these higher education issues. If there's any sunlight that breaks between them, I haven't noticed a shaft of it. LeBlanc goes on to suggest that the present residential delivery model is outdated, and that we're using it just because we romanticize it, not because it has any actual value for most students. The market, he says, wants something different, more practical, but disintegration thus means setting aside the long-standing vertical integration of higher education in the bodies of full-time faculty members. We've been doing it vertically. They break it up horizontally and spread out those tasks across a landscape of employees. At SNH, the teachers have no hand in creating course material. They don't create the course material. The people who deliver it don't create it. LeBlanc is actually thoughtful and forthcoming. He's not a monster. And he's frank. He acknowledges that traditional faculty and graduate students do and should feel threatened by such developments. As these changes are adopted, there will be winners and losers amongst higher education employees, and he's frank about that. He adds, faculty will be displaced. They will lose their jobs. And then, gently, he says that neither tenured faculty nor the shared governance process are necessarily the best ways of managing the transition to a competency-based education. Indeed not, because I hope those folks will resist. If you resist it strongly enough and with enough solidarity on your campus, it will not be futile. He adds, as we move toward the new model, this new model, it may well also be time to rethink departmental identity. Current degrees, he says, reify departmental structures that get in the way of assigning and assessing measurable enumerated competencies. Departments, he says, are mainly there to replicate themselves, not to serve any other social function. Every time you graduate a new history major, God help us, it makes it more likely that the history department will continue to exist. You graduate lots of philosophy majors, you're going to have a damn philosophy department on your campus. You got to stop doing that if you want to get rid of those forms of organization of intellectual life. Now, of course, we come to the mushrooming MOOC phenomenon, which, if you follow the news, whatever MOOCs are, it mutates weekly, right? There's some new news. A week does not go by when they haven't sort of mutated like in a science fiction film. They can obviously be adopted to the WGU model. And unlike the WGU, they will embrace the whole range of academic fields. MOOCs can then be offered to underprepared students from first-generation college attending families, and it heralds cheap education for the poor. The only problem is that most of those first-generation students are going to fail because they, more than anyone else, need social reinforcement and individual mentoring, and they're not going to get it really under this system. When Daphne Kohler, who was one of the co-founders of Coursera, was on my campus late last year, I debated her, and she said, you know, one of the great things about MOOCs is that they're perfect for underprepared students because they don't have all the pressure that there is in a classroom, and they can proceed at their own rate. And so if they're not really secure about themselves, they can pace themselves more slowly. And I said, Daphne, all the evidence says that 95% of them drop out of the course. I mean, all the evidence we have is that those are exactly the students for whom MOOCs simply don't function. Consider, as of late last year, Coursera had accumulated all of the MOOCs necessary for an undergraduate computer science major. They didn't plan a curriculum in computer science. They didn't go out to buy computer science courses like WGU did. Coursera just built the highway and faculty came. Faculty designed the courses on their own initiative, and over the course of a year and a half or so, they had a complete undergraduate degree in computer science. Daphne said that she expects within 3 to 5 years, Coursera will have the equivalent of a complete undergraduate degree in every single major discipline. So, you got a future. Buy an acre of tundra in the frozen north, set up a shack with internet capacity, and start a college. Perhaps you already are a college. You just don't happen to have a computer science department. Hire one part-time faculty member, or go giddy and hire 2 or 3, and offer a computer science degree with Coursera's MOOCs. I guarantee you that that is going to happen, and it's going to happen soon. And then the competitive financial pressures will drive other institutions to compromise what were once independent degree programs. The model is you offer a degree because you have a department that's capable of putting together a curriculum, right? But you don't need that. You aren't going to need it. You don't need it now in computer science. And over the next 3 to 5 years, the rest of what we know of as academic fields are going to drop one by one because they don't require departments anymore. They don't require faculty with expertise in that field. They require a few, administrators or faculty/administrators to help run some local version of the degree program. So it's not the arrival of MOOCs in and of themselves to which I object. I think even a traditional residential college could benefit from a limited use of MOOCs under local faculty control. Not, I must say, that any full-time tenured faculty member would want to be a kind of squire to someone else's nightly lectures. I mean, I'm going to want to teach a course when the whole lectures for the course come from some other place with some other guy or gal delivering them. I have exactly zero interest in that. So it means hiring armies of part-timers to service MOOCs locally and using them comprehensively for undergraduate degree. And I object to using MOOCs or other forms of online education as a kind of second-rate model for the poor. I also object to faculty who create a course and let it be a vehicle for hiring what amounts to wage slaves to teach it. If you have a union, you can write a model contract for anyone who designs an online course that prohibits its use in that form. There is absolutely no way that an individual faculty could get away with insisting on those rights. It is not going to happen. If you want to prevent an online course from being used as a vehicle for hiring slave labor, you've got to have a union to force that into a contract. There is absolutely no other way to do it. So, there's no longer a need for traditional full-time faculty, no need for pedagogically self-sustaining departments, no need for research, no need for tenure, for shared governance or academic freedom, except, of course, for wealthy parents who want an education for their children that goes beyond outcomes that can be assessed with multiple choice tests. On the other hand, those administrators, politicians, and businessmen who like to warn that the present economic model for higher education is unsustainable, and in the United States, that's the phrase that you hear over and over and over again, the present economic model for higher education is unsustainable. Those folks are very much in love with the idea of a disaggregated, unbundled faculty member and an automated curriculum. What is unsustainable is the inadequate social and political commitment to funding higher education. That's what's unsustainable. I couldn't behave myself when I was out in this group, talking to this group of 30 businessmen, so I said, look, cancel a couple of completely unnecessary weapons systems, and you can bring in $80 billion, which is what it costs to make all public higher education in the United States free. And they kind of glazed over, and I knew that I had lost them, but I just couldn't stop myself. This underfunding of higher education has already produced immensely increased student debt and a higher education workforce that's exploited, underpaid, and deprofessionalized. Meanwhile, administrative positions multiply, and the salaries of top administrators, like corporate CEOs, or I suppose hockey coaches in some places, soar farther and farther from their impoverished employees. And a frenzy of competitive building has drained reserves and artificially increased costs at many institutions. And under these circumstances, I am worried that more schools will respond by reducing the integrity of their core instructional mission by following the instructional model I've laid out. Now, the group of disciplines least adaptable to an instrumental multiple choice education are, of course, and job training are the humanities. We know that we're not very adaptable to job training, if we consider that an article of faith. There are collateral employee-related benefits to be gained from humanities courses. Humanities courses teach skills, from close reading of texts, to writing well, to problem solving, and abstract reasoning. All increase the value of employees, including corporate employees. But these are often secondary or supplemental to more fundamental learning processes. If a humanities defense, and that's what they mostly have done in the last 20 years, relies on the plea that we can teach your child to write business memos, it starts down a path toward diminished funding and diminished academic independence for humanities departments. Limiting the humanities' reason for existence to utilitarian services is the first step toward eviscerating the whole liberal arts model, and yet many of my colleagues around the country argue that we've got to make the case that the humanities can do things that your children will find useful. And that's not the route we need to go. All humanities courses teach teachable, testable facts. But all of us who teach, whether you're a graduate student teaching or a faculty member teaching, you know damn well that students rapidly forget the facts that they master for tests. You know it. And yet if you continue to teach that way, you're just lying to yourself. Students master facts at best when they find subject matter compelling and develop a hunger for more information. If they become fascinated by a subject, they want more information. They want to learn more factual matter. They seek it out in the library, online, elsewhere. Every year, some conservative group in the United States bewails the fact that American students don't know major facts of American history, and they do testing and prove it. They don't know this, they don't know that about American history. You can teach to those facts, you can teach them, you can test them, and they'll forget them next year or sooner. Students will master the basic facts of their history of their country when they care about it, when they care about the subject matter, when they are interested in it. They'll only hold those facts in their heads if it matters to them. Testing them is not going to produce that. That kind of devotion also comes often from the pursuit of specialized topics, not from general, universal, shared content. I stopped giving tests 25 years ago. I haven't given a test since, when I realized that I was only opting for a test when I had failed a course's deeper aims. The course wasn't succeeding, it wasn't doing what I wanted to do, so I'm going to punish them, give them tests, make them prove to me that they've learned something, even though I knew that they hadn't learned a damn thing. So then I just stopped doing it. My university requires a final exam, but I just don't give them, and they've learned it's easier not to bother me than to make an issue of it. Now, I am willing to concede that an accounting course may be more fully testable than an English course. There are probably some subjects that are more amenable to that assessment model than others. Although actually it might not hurt for an accounting major to be able to think about what he or she is doing when a businessman asks, when their firm asks them to do unethical procedures. If they'd had a good education, they might actually have a qualm or two about it. But I can understand why an institution like WGU, which limits its curriculum so narrowly, can succeed. And LeBlanc acknowledges, that's the Southern New Hampshire guy, that there may be some topics less well adapted to testing and assessment. When I asked him about that recently, he actually gave a good example. He said, well, yeah, what if you assign a student an essay about whether torture can ever be ethical? Worth assigning in the US, by the way. Are multiple choice questions going to really show you that a student has thought through that issue in some way that actually matters to them? Can you get it, those ethical issues, on multiple choice tests? Well, I don't think so. But he says humanities faculty members are very fuzzy about their goals, and pushing them to be clearer is beneficial. I agree that pressure is useful, but not if it comes in the form of a formal assessment and competency regime imposed on the faculty or threatened for the faculty. I find myself that weekly emails from students to everyone in class discussion, and papers give me a pretty reliable basis for finding out whether people are benefiting from a course. Beyond that, I'm not interested in imposing a course's lessons on my students. I care about whether the course matters to them and about whether it may spark long-term commitments, even whether a course may alter their view of the world. But it's fundamentally up to the students to decide whether to invest in what I teach in a fundamental way. That's a choice they have to make. I'm not interested in compelling them to make the choice. My job, as I see it, is to place certain kind of knowledge on the table and to put certain kind of challenging questions out there that have the potential to engage deep commitment. And if it does, I'll learn as much from those students as they learn from me. But it's their choice to decide whether a course should become central to their lives. Has this course changed your life? Is not a question for a multiple choice exam, and I don't even consider it ethical to insist that students learn what I have to teach. I offer it in the best way I can. I hope that I can capture them, but I'm not going to bully them into it. They have to step over the line to make that decision. So I'm not interested in proving by any means whatsoever that they have all learned what I sought to teach. I have no interest in proving it. And so testing it or assessing it in any kind of way is not going to help me learn what I need to learn. I can find no better example of what I mean than a seminar I teach on Holocaust poetry. The poems are extremely painful to read. Class discussion combines detailed analysis of the texts with opportunities to share the struggle to deal with both the historical background and the unique perspectives the poems offer. The issues we pursue are some of the most basic and troubling ones that arise from the 20th century's many killing fields. What does it mean to be human? Can civilization guarantee any forms of human decency? Are any monstrous behaviors or organized forms of evil impossible in human society? Is there any kind of demonic behavior that we cannot engage in as human beings? What hope is left to us in the wake of industrialized mass murder? How do we take on the burden of poems whose authors are declaring that life is no longer living? Do we really want to enter into the inner world of concentration camp life? Are we fully capable of understanding that or any other extreme horror? What purpose do acts of witness to the unspeakable serve for later generations? That's one cluster of questions and course aims that I'm working with, and I am not interested, I consider it frankly obscene to kind of either force my students to take those questions seriously or to try to assess in some organized way whether they have taken those questions into their hearts or not. To teach this body of poetry forthrightly, so I argue in the course, is to confront a future without hope, with no reason for confidence that humane values have any transcendent character or any guaranteed hold on the future. Nothing is guaranteed. I think it's fair to say that most American citizens would prefer to believe otherwise, to retain some measure of faith in human nature. But the poetry that we read during that semester shows us that we are no better than what we are made to be, and that we can be made to be absolutely anything. What remains if confidence in both human nature and providence is stripped away is reliance on our own efforts, on our own work, our responsibility to construct cultural values and meaningful will. It's Gramsci's motto in another form: optimism of the will and pessimism of the intellect. I have plenty of pessimism of the intellect about higher education. I never seem to find enough of it, but I retain optimism of the will in any case. Let me read just one Holocaust poem. And this is, I'm going to read a couple of poems from different domains. And I'm going to pick poems that kind of you can hear in an audience. You don't have to like sit down and read them. And carefully, you can hear some of what's going. They're fairly simple. It's Ilse Weber's A Nursery Rhyme from Theresienstadt, where Weber was held from 1942 to 44 before being taken to Auschwitz and murdered that October. The poem actually reworks a traditional children's song, so it's going to have a kind of sing-song character to it, because she's taken a children's song and kind of re-envisioned it for the Holocaust, translated from the German. Heave, look out ahead. Here comes the wagon with the dead. Heave, look out ahead, the wagon with the dead. We stop right here and stop right there. We drive dead bodies everywhere. Look ahead, the wagon with the dead. Heave, look out ahead. Destroyed and gone, all that we had. Heave, look out ahead. Destroyed and gone, I said. The end of joy, our homes away, our luggage left the other day. Look ahead, we're coming with the dead. Heave, look out ahead. They've hitched us to the cart instead. Heave, look out ahead. They've hitched us up instead. If all our pain were put on it, we wouldn't even move one bit. Look ahead, a wagon full of dead. My students send an email to the class every week reflecting on the readings assigned. I'm just going to read you some brief quotations from some of the emails one student sent in the course of the semester, and he's responding to different poems that we read for that week. Death for these poems is not a torment at all. To have escaped, to have been spared, is to have been swallowed by an oblivion darker than the death into which those who were murdered disappeared. To have perished amongst one's own is more desirable than to have lived to experience the solitude that remains without them. The life that managed to evade death, if it can be inhabited at all, is unfit for living. How can one speak of being rescued when deliverance only transports those saved from abyss to abyss? The speaker's world is a necropolis, populated by the victims for whom no monument commemorates their grave. Within it, he answers to the call of the dead whose voices others do not hear. The survivors do not only live off their bodies, the life of their bodies is that which their bodies expel in order to live. They consume their own death. How can I fulfill my responsibility to the victims of the Holocaust when my responsibility remains bottomless? So that to me is someone who's taken the questions the course proposes seriously, and I don't need to assess him any further. I need to talk with him, continue a relationship with him, but the whole assessment protocol is, I think, at that point, genuinely obscene. I've described this course as belonging to a category that I call the fierce humanities. And I have argued that it exemplifies the unsettling challenges that a liberal arts education can offer. And for me, that's what a liberal arts education is about. My aim is to make life more complex and difficult for my students, not to give them skills I can test. But as I said, I don't require them to step over the line into radical doubt and uncertainty. I give them the opportunity and a forum in which it's possible. Now, the humanities are not unique in offering such opportunities. Science education should include an effort to understand the relationship between doubt and certainty in science. And that's equally troubling for people, to realize that science is a series of ongoing guesses that can be undermined by the next year's work. But I do find that such questions can be defining in humanities courses, and that takes them out of the instrumental educational frame. I use the example of my Holocaust course because it's, I think, very clear. But the situation is not notably different when I teach a series of poems about race relations in the United States. The poems do things that cannot be encompassed by a factual history of race in America. There is certainly history to be taught, from the slave trade through post-Civil War Reconstruction to the Civil Rights Movement and beyond. But that's not the center of the course. The center of the course is the challenges that the poems offer, which are going to be deeper and more unsettling to what is, after all, the major social wound of the United States for centuries. The most ambitious, compelling poem about African American history by a white author, and there aren't a lot, happens to be Aaron Kramer's 1952 poem sequence, 26 poems, about plans for an 1822 South Carolina slave revolt. The title of this poem sequence, Denmark Vesey, is the name of the black man who planned the revolt and who was lynched. I want to read you one poem from the sequence, one of 26, and it's called Vesey's Nightmare, which is the title character's vision of a banquet and a ball held by plantation owners at one point. It took Vesey long to fall asleep that night. Over and over he heard the minuet, till tossing and turning he fell into a dream. It was Colonel Pouliot's banqueting room. There stood the colonel, bursting through his coat, flanked by half the legislature of the state, all busy sampling and praising the food. Instead of an ordinary meal, they had young Negro bodies baked to the bone. Their fountain of wine was a Negro vein. The lovely brocade their ladies wore had once been Negro grandmother's hair. The gems that blinked on their arms like stars were bright Negro eyes that had lately shed tears. The drummer was beating a broad Negro chest, and instead of on trumpets, the trumpeters placed thin lips on the whole of a Negro throat that made a lament of the minuet. Now lightly, now heavily, dancers caroused on black children's faces, moaning and bruised, while one slave kept bending to mop up the blood, for which he received many pats on the head. The colonel smiled proudly up at his lamps. They were Negro souls, which he'd bought for worn pants. Now they saw Vesey, they were pointing at him. Not I, he shrieked, and fled from the dream. Vesey, in the poem, doesn't wake up. He flees the nightmare, perhaps imagining fleeing the South. Is such a nightmare so unlikely for black men who lived in fear of being lynched? What would it feel like to live your life as a young and finally adult black male in that plantation South, or of course during Reconstruction, and worry that you might be lynched by a mob? And is it in some ways not just the labor, but also the bodies of black slaves that the U.S. consumed? I don't think it's fair to say that the poet is actually linking slavery with the Holocaust and the Nazi willingness to make products out of Jewish body parts. He's taking what had recently been learned about the Holocaust and using it to ask readers to think about slavery in the American South. In any case, the challenges the poem offers to students can neither be explored or, again, tested by the assessment model. It asks them to look into the dark heart of slavery more deeply than they have before, more deeply than a factual history might press them to do, with the kind of strange metaphorical capacity that poetry has. I stand on the side of those who argue we need a humanities, liberal arts, and educational offensive, not a reactive, apologetic defense of the benefits of higher education. We need to own the cultural, intellectual, and religious challenges an uncompromising education can bring to our students. Organized resistance to the destructive forces higher education faces is not futile. But that means really taking public possession of the cultural territory that we have claims on, not apologizing for it. Such an educational offensive will include all of the individual work we can do, but as I said at the outset, it's also going to require collective action, action, for me, best undertaken through collective bargaining when that option is available. And of course, in Canada it is. It ain't available in much of the United States. but only if faculty unions are willing to embrace a broad social agenda, making academic freedom and shared governance central to collective bargaining agreements, fighting for fair compensation and benefits for all employees, students, secretaries, maintenance workers. A union has to fight for social justice, not just for the people it represents, but for everyone in the community. If it doesn't do that, then it's not worth being a union. Yes, fight administrative bloat, and certainly work on what in the United States is the increasing problem of student debt. Compel through your union contracts that higher education's budgets focus on teaching and research, not, dare I say, on coaches' salaries. CAUT has a good record of defining basic principles and putting them at the center of the union's agenda. I've worked with them periodically for nearly a decade, and I have confidence that a strengthened relationship with them by becoming a collective bargaining representative for the faculty will benefit SFU. We all need to realize that our administrators will be under increasing peer pressure to unbundle faculty responsibilities, hire more contingent faculty, and adapt the curriculum to the outcomes and assessment agenda. In the US, such peer pressure is supplemented by incredible political pressure and by increasing intervention by state and federal governments. And we have a peculiar situation that facilitates state and federal government intervention into the curriculum, and that's through teacher training. In the United States, the state governments have a whole lot of case law that says they have a right to control K-12 education, to basically have a lot of authority over it. So they're now saying, well, if the courts say we have authority over K-12 education, why don't we have authority over the training for the teachers who will be doing K-12 education? So they're moving the assessment and accountability agenda into the education curriculum as a start. That's kind of the entry point, the wedge. I think the balance of power needs to be recalculated so faculty and graduate teaching assistants can regain authority over academic matters. Resistance is not futile. Thanks.